So this week we're going to be looking at Romans chapter 10. And one of the interesting questions to ask is something that comes up right at the beginning of our text, which is actually going to be the last few verses of chapter 9. So at the very end of chapter 9, Paul starts describing these two different paths, right? There are the Gentiles who weren't seeking righteousness but have obtained it because they sought it by faith. Right? We've been learning all through the book of Romans that it's only by faith in Jesus Christ, right, that we are brought into right relationship with him. Our condemnation is taken away. We're adopted into the family of God. But by contrast, the Jewish people of Paul's day, who were earnestly seeking God, were being denied because they were choosing a different path that doesn't actually lead to God. They were trying to be justified based on their historical lineage. They're thinking, look, we're people who are descended from Abraham. We keep the law. That's it. That's what makes us part of the people of God. And that sort of, biologically based, law-defined way of defining who the people of God is, Paul is saying is just false. It doesn't work. Instead, Paul is now going to reiterate the gospel. And in fact, the middle verses of chapter 10 have some of the classic verses people will often use when they're wanting to try to share the gospel with people. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. A little bit later, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, right? Now, those verses that we often kind of take out of context are still part of a larger chapter that's still all about God's relationship with the Jewish people. That argument runs from chapter 9 all the way through the end of chapter 11. You can see it at the beginning of chapter 10. He's still talking about it at the end of chapter 10. And one way of understanding the framing is this, and I think it's related to what he started saying back in chapter 9. Back in chapter 9, remember, the question was raised, well, look, if God really is faithful to his promises, what about that promise to Abraham that through him all the peoples of the earth were going to be blessed? What about his descendants? I mean, how do we reconcile the fact that so many Jewish people are rejecting the Messiah and don't seem to be a part of that plan that God had? And the answer was in chapter 9, look, God in his sovereignty, not through any merit the people had, chose particular people like Jacob over Esau, to have a special role, right? And God was able to choose some and not others through no merit that the people had. Now, that was hard going for us to get our minds around. And we started getting into these questions. Well, if this is all about God's sovereign election, why does God still blame us, right? Because if he's determining us to play this particular part in the story, isn't it unfair for him to give us the part and then blame us for playing it? And I think something similar is still part of the answer that Paul is making in Romans chapter 10. Because if you look at the very last verse, he's going back and he's quoting Isaiah, and his bottom line is this: all day long, God has been holding out his hands to a disobedient, stubborn, obstinate people, right? That's the basic message. In other words, what he's going to tell us through chapter 10 is that the problem is not with God, the problem is with Israel. The gospel is clear. The gospel is held out on the same terms to both Jews and Gentiles. Anyone, no matter whether you're a Jew or Gentile, if you will believe in Jesus Christ, put your trust in him, you will be saved. And that message has been communicated. The problem is the refusal of the Jewish people to accept that message, right? That's, I think, the basic message of chapter 10. Now, in the middle of that, we get a restatement of the gospel. And because that restatement applies just as much to us as Gentiles as it would to Jewish people, it's appropriate, I think, for us to camp out on those middle verses and to really think about that clear statement of the gospel. So in your connection group, I think one of the crucial questions to talk about would be, what does it look like in our day for people to try to pick some other path to being a part of the family of God, to being in right relationship with God, other than faith? And this is actually particularly important for religious people, because I think religious people are more likely to want to have their identity wound up in what good people they are. And so it's hard for them to accept that they could really be in a relationship with God, and the ultimate basis of that relationship isn't anything that they've done, any good things that they've done. And even though we can sort of say intellectually, oh, I know it's all about grace and not about by works, it's very easy in our Christian lives to start slipping back into that works-based mentality. And then also, I think this is a great time to kind of just ask people in your group the question, have you called on the name of the Lord? Have you confessed that Jesus is the risen Lord? When did that happen? What did that look like for you? And it's a chance to give people who may not have talked about this before a chance to talk about how they became a Christian. And for some people, it may have been a longer, kind of messier kind of process, not sort of one instant. But there clearly needs to be some point at which they can say, you know what, at this particular time, I know for sure I believed that Jesus Christ was my risen Lord and Savior. I called on him to rescue me, to save me. Because I think there are people in our connection groups who aren't yet believers. And these key verses in chapter 10 are a great opportunity to kind of press in and try to get to the truth about what people really believe about Jesus and what they've really put their faith in.